Did you know that one of the most famous battle cries in movie history was almost never recorded? The roar you hear when William Wallace charges across that field, that sound that makes your chest tighten and your heart pound, almost didn't happen at all. Braveheart is one of those films that feels bigger than a movie. It feels like memory. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about Braveheart. Number 20. The director who became a warrior king. Mel Gibson did not just direct Braveheart. He became William Wallace. And that was a problem nobody expected. When Gibson first agreed to make the film, the studio imagined him only as the director. He would stand behind the camera, call the shots, and let someone else wear the war paint. But Gibson had a different idea burning inside him. He wanted to play Wallace himself. He believed that only someone who truly felt the story could tell it from the inside out. So he took on both roles, director and lead actor, at the same time. Now, most people in Hollywood will tell you that doing both jobs on a massive historical epic is close to impossible. You're trying to lead armies of extras while also remembering your own lines. You're trying to frame a shot while your face is still covered in blue paint. You're giving emotional directions to other actors while you yourself are supposed to be crying. Gibson described those days as completely overwhelming. There were mornings when he would arrive on set before sunrise, get dressed in full medieval costume, direct the setup of an enormous battle sequence, then walk in front of the camera and deliver lines that required deep personal vulnerability. Some days he finished filming, sat down in his director's chair, and had no memory of how he had gotten through the scene. The pressure was enormous. But something strange happened. The dual role made him better at both jobs. Because he was always in the scene, always feeling the cold mud and the heavy armor, his direction became more instinctive, more raw. He didn't need to explain to the other actors what the scene should feel like. He was already living it. What looked effortless on screen was an exhausting double life behind the camera. Number 19. Scotland was actually Ireland. Here is something that surprises almost everyone. Braveheart is a story about Scotland. William Wallace is Scotland's greatest hero. The film is called a Scottish epic, and almost none of it was filmed in Scotland. The vast majority of the movie, including the legendary battle sequences, was shot in Ireland. Specifically, the filmmakers used the Irish Midlands, the wide green fields near Trim Castle in County Meath, and the mountains of Wicklow to stand in for the Scottish Highlands. Why? The answer is practical and a little sad. Scotland, while beautiful, proved difficult for large-scale filming at the time. The weather was even more unpredictable than Ireland's. The available locations were harder to control. And most importantly, the Irish government offered something Scotland could not: the Irish Army. Thousands of real soldiers from the Irish Defence Forces were made available as extras for the battle scenes. These were not actors pretending to be fighters. These were trained military men who could march in formation, follow commands, and make the chaos of medieval warfare look believable. The production hired hundreds of them for weeks at a time. They swung swords, rode horses, and crashed into each other across fields that looked nothing like a film set. Some of them later joked that it was the strangest assignment in their military careers. The landscape of Ireland was carefully dressed with props and set decoration to suggest Scotland. Hills were renamed, castles were relabeled, and audiences around the world looked at those rolling green fields and whispered the word Scotland without ever knowing they were looking at Ireland. What felt like the homeland of William Wallace was filmed thousands of miles from where he was born. Number 18. The blue paint problem. Every Scottish warrior in Braveheart wears the famous blue face paint, the war paint of the ancient Picts. It became one of the most iconic images of the film. Children painted their faces blue after seeing it. Halloween costumes were designed around it. But here is what most people do not know. The blue face paint used in the film was historically wrong. The ancient Picts did use a blue dye called woad on their skin during battle. That part is true. But historians believe woad was actually used more for tattoos than for dramatic face painting. The striking, almost theatrical blue swirls that Gibson and his warriors wore were largely a cinematic invention, a dramatic visual choice designed to make the warriors look fierce and memorable on screen. The makeup team spent enormous effort developing the paint. It had to survive rain, sweat, and physical combat. It had to photograph well on camera. It had to look terrifying up close, but also readable from a distance when thousands of extras were spread across a field. Developing that specific formula took months of testing. And then came the real problem. Getting hundreds of extras painted every single morning took hours. The makeup tents looked like assembly lines. Row after row of people sitting in chairs while artists applied blue paint to their faces, necks, and arms. Some days the process started before 4 in the morning just to have everyone ready by sunrise. Actors joked that they spent more time in the makeup chair than on the actual battlefield. And after shooting finished each day, washing the paint off was a battle of its own. What looked ancient and wild on screen was the result of industrial precision behind the camera. Number 17, a real princess who barely spoke. Sophie Marceau plays Princess Isabel of France, the noblewoman who secretly falls in love with William Wallace. She is graceful, intelligent, and emotionally powerful in every scene. But here is a secret about her presence in the film. Marceau's scenes with Gibson were incredibly limited in terms of direct interaction during production. The two actors were rarely filmed together in the same physical space at the same time. Many of their most emotionally charged scenes were shot separately and then combined in editing. Marceau also faced the challenge of acting in English, which was not her first language. French was her native tongue, and while she spoke English well, the emotional subtlety required for her role demanded an extra layer of effort. She had to feel deeply in a language that was not the language of her heart. Gibson has spoken about watching her work and being genuinely moved by her dedication. She approached every scene with absolute seriousness. There is a moment in the film where Isabel whispers a message to the dying Wallace. A moment so quiet and tender, it feels almost too private to watch. That scene was filmed with extraordinary care. The two actors worked slowly through it, testing different distances, different tones of voice, different emotional temperatures. The final result feels effortless. It feels like two people who have known each other for years. But it was built from careful craftsmanship on both sides. What felt like natural chemistry was actually disciplined artistic construction. Two worlds met quietly in that scene, and the audience felt every single word. Number 16. The horses were real champions. The battle sequences in Braveheart involved hundreds of horses, and these were not ordinary rental animals brought in for a few hours. The production employed some of the finest trained stunt horses available in Europe. Their training was specialized, intense, and years in the making. Each horse used in close combat scenes had been trained to perform specific movements, rearing up on command, stopping suddenly, falling safely on cue. The word safely is important here. Hollywood has strict animal welfare rules, and every horse fall you see in the film was a controlled, rehearsed movement. The animals were trained to drop to the ground on command without injury. Their trainers worked alongside them every single day, monitoring their condition, watching for stress, adjusting the schedule when any animal showed signs of exhaustion. The sheer number of horses on the battlefield created logistical challenges nobody fully anticipated. Keeping hundreds of large animals calm in a chaotic environment with noise, crowds, and explosions required an entire team of dedicated wranglers. Some horses were naturally nervous around the controlled explosions used to simulate cannon fire and battlefield chaos. Those animals were carefully assessed and removed from scenes that might disturb them. New horses were brought in. The choreography of the battles had to account not just for human actors, but for the behavior of animals who could not read a script. Riders had to feel their horse's mood in real time and adjust. Directors had to watch the animals as carefully as the actors. What looked like wild, unstoppable cavalry charges was the result of months of animal training, careful safety planning, and genuine partnership between humans and horses. Not just acting, real trust. Number 15. The Sword That Weighed a Nightmare. William Wallace's sword is one of the most famous weapons in movie history. Long, heavy, and ancient-looking, it became a symbol of the film. But carrying that sword all day was a completely different experience from watching it on screen. The replica swords used in the film were built to look authentic and imposing, and authentic medieval two-handed swords are not light objects. The production's weapon designers built several versions for different types of shots. Lighter versions for scenes requiring fast movement, heavier versions for close-up shots where the weight and texture needed to look real. But even the lighter versions were heavy enough to create serious strain after hours of use. Gibson has mentioned that his shoulders and arms would be burning by the end of long fight days. The extras and stunt performers faced the same challenge. Imagine running across a muddy field, wearing heavy clothing and armor, swinging a large steel replica sword for hours in the rain. Some performers developed muscle injuries simply from the repetitive motion. The stunt coordinators had to build rest periods into the shooting schedule, specifically to prevent people from hurting themselves from exhaustion. The sword training alone took weeks before filming began. Performers had to learn how to move with the weapon in a way that looked natural, but also stayed safe for everyone nearby. One wrong swing in a crowd of extras could cause a serious injury. The discipline required was almost military. What looked like wild, passionate warfare was in reality a carefully choreographed dance with heavy metal in the middle of an Irish field. It looked like rage. It felt like a workout. Number 14. The weather that nobody planned for. Ireland's weather is famously unpredictable. Anyone who has spent time there knows that 4 seasons can happen in a single afternoon. The Braveheart production crew knew this going in. They planned for rain. They built schedules with weather delays. They prepared backup shots for cloudy days. But the actual weather during filming went far beyond anything they had prepared for. There were days when the rain fell so hard that camera equipment had to be covered and moved inside. There were days when fog descended so thickly that the cameras could barely see 20 feet in front of them. The crew worked in temperatures that made the mud freeze overnight, then thaw into thick, ankle-deep pools by midday. Extras in light medieval costumes stood in that mud for hours. Some of them got sick. The medical team on set was kept extraordinarily busy. But here is the twist that nobody expected. Some of the weather actually made the film better. Several scenes that feel most emotionally powerful. The misty battlefield moments, the gray Scottish light that seems to press down on everything, were the result of genuine atmospheric conditions that the crew did not create and could not control. The cinematographer, John Toll, who won an Academy Award for his work on the film, spoke later about learning to love the Irish weather. He began to see the fog and the rain not as obstacles, but as gifts. The camera caught things that a Hollywood lighting rig could never manufacture. The cold air, the actual breath of the actors visible in real morning frost, the way mud splashed genuinely. What nobody planned became some of the most beautiful footage in the film. Number 13. The soundtrack that changed everything. James Horner wrote the music for Braveheart, and the score he created is widely considered one of the greatest film soundtracks ever composed. The sweeping Celtic melodies, the heartbreaking use of pipes and strings, the sudden silences before massive orchestral climaxes. It all feels completely inevitable, as if no other music could possibly belong to this story. But Horner composed the score under extraordinary time pressure. He was given a very tight deadline, and the sheer scope of the music required, covering battles, love scenes, executions, and triumphs, was enormous. He worked almost continuously for weeks. He brought in traditional Irish and Scottish musicians to record live instruments that gave the score its authentic texture. The William pipes, the traditional Irish bagpipe played with an elbow bellows, feature prominently throughout the film. Finding musicians who could play those instruments at the required level for a major film recording session took significant effort. But the strangest thing about the score is this. Horner finished large portions of the music before the film was fully edited. He was composing to rough cuts, to incomplete scenes, to sequences that were still changing shape. He had to imagine what the final film would feel like and write music for a story that wasn't fully told yet. When the final edit came together and his music was laid underneath the images, the result was almost miraculous. The music and the picture matched each other so perfectly that it seemed like they had always been one thing. One small melody changed the entire emotional weight of the film. Number 12. The execution scene that silenced the crew. There is a scene near the end of Braveheart that is very difficult to watch. It is the execution of William Wallace, a scene of extreme violence that was shot with full awareness of its historical basis. What happened to Wallace in reality was brutal and public. The filmmakers had to decide how honestly to portray it. Gibson made a deliberate choice. He would not soften the scene. He would let the audience feel the weight of what happened to this man. The filming of that sequence was one of the most emotionally intense days on the entire production. The crew, who had spent months working together, who had laughed and complained and eaten terrible catering food side by side, fell completely silent. Technicians who normally joked between takes stood still and said nothing. Some members of the production team later admitted they had to step away from the monitors and collect themselves. Gibson, who was both performing in the scene and directing it, found it almost impossible to separate himself from the character at that point in the story. He had spent months living inside Wallace. He had read everything available about the man's life and death. And now he was filming the end of that life. The emotional truth of the scene, the thing that makes it almost unbearable to watch in the cinema, was not manufactured. It was felt by everyone in that field on that cold Irish morning. That wasn't acting anymore. It was something harder to name. Number 11. The kilts problem. Here is a historical fact that Braveheart gets spectacularly wrong, and one that Scottish historians have been pointing out ever since the film was released. The iconic kilts worn by the Scottish warriors in the film were not actually worn in the 13th century. Kilts, the belted, pleated garments associated with Scottish Highland culture, did not appear in Scotland until centuries after William Wallace lived. Historians generally date the belted plaid to around the 16th century. Wallace died in 1305. So the warriors running into battle in those dramatic kilts were wearing something their real historical counterparts had never seen. The costume designers knew this. They made a deliberate choice to prioritize recognizability over historical accuracy. They wanted audiences to immediately understand that these were Scottish Highlanders. And kilts had become the universal visual shorthand for that identity. It was a practical, cinematic decision, but it sparked a debate that never fully ended. Some Scottish historians were genuinely upset by the anachronism. Others argued that cinema is not a history lesson and that emotional truth matters more than textile accuracy. Gibson's response was fairly simple. He was making a story about a human being's courage and sacrifice, not a documentary about 13th century clothing. The kilts stayed. And ironically, the image of kilt-wearing warriors in Braveheart became so powerful that it renewed worldwide interest in actual Scottish history and culture. The historical mistake helped bring people closer to history. What was wrong on the costume rail turned out to be right in the cultural conversation. Number 10. The real William Wallace. William Wallace is presented in Braveheart as a farmer's son who became a military genius almost by accident. But the real historical Wallace is far more mysterious than the film suggests. Historians actually know remarkably little about his early life. There are no reliable records of where he was born, who his parents were, or what his childhood looked like. The film takes significant creative liberties in constructing his origins, including the romance with Murren, which has no solid historical basis. What historians do know is that Wallace emerged suddenly as a military leader in 1297, won the stunning Battle of Stirling Bridge, served briefly as Guardian of Scotland, and was captured and executed in 1305. Those 8 years in between are the heart of his known story. But the man before those years, the boy, the young man, the private person, is largely invisible to history. The filmmakers worked with this absence by filling it with imagination. They created a Wallace who is recognizable as a human being, someone who loves, grieves, doubts, and rages. Whether that portrait is accurate to the real person is unknowable. What we can say is that it is deeply felt. Randall Wallace, who wrote the screenplay, has spoken about feeling a kind of mysterious connection to the story, noting that his own surname matched the hero's. He has described the writing process as something that felt almost like remembering rather than inventing. The past whispered, and a writer listened. Whether history approves or not, the story endures. Number 9, the Academy Award. Surprise Braveheart won 5 Academy Awards at the 1996 ceremony, including Best Picture and Best Director. This was, by almost any measure, a major surprise. The film had been received with mixed critical reaction when it was first released. Some critics loved it passionately, others found it too violent, too long, and too historically loose. The conventional wisdom going into awards season was that Braveheart was a popular film but not necessarily a serious awards contender. The film it was competing most directly against was Apollo 13, a film about real astronauts based on real events made with technical precision and emotional restraint. Many industry observers predicted Apollo 13 would take the top prizes. When Braveheart's name was called for Best Picture, there was a genuine moment of surprise in the room. Mel Gibson's win for Best Director was perhaps even more unexpected. He was known as an actor. His previous directorial work, The Man Without a Face, had been modest. The idea that he had directed one of the most visually complex historical epics of the decade and done it well enough to beat every other director in Hollywood that year was genuinely astonishing to many people in the industry. The victory changed Gibson's career permanently. It established him as a filmmaker to be taken seriously, not just a charismatic screen presence, but a genuine cinematic artist. One night changed everything, not just the actor, the storyteller. Number 8. The mud was real and terrible. The battle scenes in Braveheart are among the most physically demanding ever filmed, and a huge part of that was the mud. The Irish fields used for filming became churned into deep, thick mud very quickly once horses and hundreds of extras started moving across them. The production team had not fully anticipated how bad this would get. On some days, the mud was so deep that extras were sinking past their ankles with every step. Moving across the battlefield required genuine physical effort, the kind that makes your legs burn after 50 yards. The horses struggled in it, equipment got stuck in it, camera operators carrying heavy rigs fell in it. The smell of wet earth, horse sweat, and hundreds of unwashed costume pieces hung over the set on still mornings. Some of the extras described arriving at work in the dark, stepping out of their transport onto a field that looked like a war zone from an entirely different era of history, and wondering what exactly they had signed up for. But the mud also became one of the film's greatest visual assets. When warriors fell in battle, they fell into real earth. When men crawled wounded across the field, they dragged real mud with them. The weight and reality of it, The genuine effort you can see in the actors' movements cannot be faked by a Hollywood set. The camera captured something true inside all that discomfort. What felt terrible in the morning looked magnificent on screen. Number 7. Patrick McGoohan's magnificent villainy. Patrick McGoohan plays King Edward I, known as Longshanks, in Braveheart, and his performance is one of the most quietly terrifying things in the entire film. McGoohan was already a legendary figure in British television, famous for his iconic work in The Prisoner. But his Edward is something different, cold, arrogant, and completely certain of his own right to destroy anyone who opposes him. What most people don't know is how little time McGoohan actually spent on the film. His scenes were concentrated, and his filming schedule was comparatively short. But the impact he creates is enormous. The reason is preparation. McGoohan arrived knowing Edward perfectly. He had researched the historical king extensively. He understood the man's logic, the way Edward genuinely believed that his conquest of Scotland was not cruelty, but civilization. That belief, so horrifying to modern audiences, was performed by McGoohan with complete internal commitment. He never played Edward as a cartoon villain. He played him as a man who was entirely correct, in his own mind, about everything. That made the character far more frightening than any amount of mustache twirling would have. There is a scene where Edward throws his daughter-in-law across a room with complete calm, barely pausing his conversation. The casual violence of that moment, the utter lack of drama in his cruelty, is one of the most unsettling things in the film. McGoohan found the truth of a monster, and the truth was that the monster didn't think he was won. That wasn't evil performing. That was evil believing. Number 6. The Battle of Stirling. Wasn't at Stirling. The Battle of Stirling Bridge is one of the most important events in Scottish history. William Wallace's real victory over the English at Stirling Bridge in 1297 was a stunning military achievement. A smaller, lighter Scottish force defeating a much larger English army by using the narrow bridge as a tactical choke point. The bridge was the whole point. Without it, the battle would have been very different. And in Braveheart's version of the battle, the bridge is gone, completely absent. The battle is fought across an open field, which is historically and tactically different from what actually happened. The filmmakers made this choice for a combination of practical and creative reasons. Filming a battle that depended on a specific bridge would have required a very particular location and enormous construction. An open field battle was visually more spectacular. It allowed cameras to show vast numbers of warriors clashing across a wide space. But historians were not happy. The bridge was not a small detail. It was the entire tactical story of why Wallace won. By removing it, the film turned a story about military intelligence into a story about courage and passion alone. Some have argued that this change fundamentally altered the message of Wallace's legacy, suggesting he won through emotion rather than strategy. Gibson's response was, again, that this was cinema, not scholarship. The open field looked better. The drama worked. The bridge stayed in the history books and off the screen. What was lost in accuracy was gained in spectacle. Number 5. The love story that never happened. The central love story in Braveheart, the romance between William Wallace and Murren, whose murder triggers his entire rebellion, is almost entirely fictional. There is a very old Scottish ballad tradition that associates a woman named Marion Braidfute with Wallace. Some accounts suggest she was real. Others suggest she was a romantic myth added to the legend centuries after his death. What is certain is that the emotional story of two young lovers secretly married, torn apart by English cruelty, with that loss driving one man to ignite a nation's resistance, that story is the creation of the screenwriter Randall Wallace, not the historical record. But the power of that fictional story is enormous. It gives the entire film its emotional engine. Without Murren's death, without that particular grief, Wallace's rebellion could look like simple politics or nationalism. With it, the rebellion becomes something universal, the response of a human heart to an unbearable loss. Every audience member who has ever loved someone and feared losing them understands that engine immediately. The emotion crosses every cultural and historical border. Randall Wallace built a fiction that contained a profound human truth. And that truth, that love can be the source of a nation's courage, is perhaps the most powerful idea in the entire film. What never happened historically created the most real thing the audience ever felt. Number 4. Mel Gibson's physical transformation. Preparing to play William Wallace was not simply a matter of learning lines and growing a beard. Mel Gibson underwent an intense physical preparation process to inhabit the role convincingly. The training involved swordsmanship, horseback riding at a military level, combat movement, and general physical conditioning designed to make him look like a man who has spent his life using his body as a tool of survival. The horseback riding alone required months of work. Gibson was already an experienced rider, but the level of riding required for the film, extended galloping across uneven terrain, combat maneuvers, controlling an animal while carrying weapons and wearing heavy costume, demanded a much higher level than any previous role had required. The sword training was conducted by professional fight choreographers who specialized in medieval combat techniques. They had to balance historical authenticity with cinematic readability. Real sword fighting looks quite different from what audiences expect to see on screen, and the difference had to be carefully managed. Beyond the physical skills, Gibson also changed his body shape. He put on significant muscle mass in the months before filming and maintained it through the entire shoot. But the irony was that by the time filming wrapped, after months of intense physical work in difficult weather conditions, Gibson had actually lost weight and was visibly leaner than when he started. The production was that demanding, the battlefield consumed him slowly. He arrived a prepared athlete and finished looking like a man who had actually been to war. What began as performance became physical truth. Shot. Number 3. The crowd scenes were almost impossible. The sheer number of human beings required for the battle scenes in Braveheart created organizational challenges that tested the entire production team almost to its breaking point. On the largest battle days, the set contained over 1,000 extras, hundreds of horses, multiple camera crews, stunt teams, medical teams, translation teams, because not all of the Irish military extras spoke the same language as the American crew. Costume teams, makeup teams, and catering operations large enough to feed a small town. Coordinating all of these elements for a single shot required military-level planning. Shot lists were prepared days in advance. Choreography was rehearsed in sections. Indeed, radio communication systems were set up across the field. But even with all of that preparation, things went wrong constantly. Extras lost their positions. Horses moved unexpectedly. Weather changed the light in the middle of a carefully planned sequence. Sound equipment picked up modern aircraft flying overhead, a recurring nightmare on outdoor historical shoots. On several occasions, an entire day's filming had to be scrapped and rescheduled because a sequence simply could not be completed within the available light. The crew worked through exhaustion that built week after week. But the cumulative effect of all those difficult days, all that real effort, real weather, real muscle, and real mud, is visible in every frame. The chaos of those battle scenes doesn't look constructed. It looks discovered. That was not chaos controlled. It was chaos captured. Number 2. The famous freedom speech. There is one scene in Braveheart that has entered permanent cultural memory. It is the moment before the Battle of Stirling, when Wallace rides along the line of his troops, many of whom want to retreat, and delivers a speech about freedom that has been quoted, parodied, referenced, and repeated countless times in the 30 years since the film was released. The speech ends with the word freedom, a single word shouted at the sky with everything Gibson had. That word has been used in political speeches, sports motivations, graduation ceremonies, and late-night television jokes. It has taken on a life completely separate from the film that created it. But here is what almost nobody knows about how that scene was filmed. The speech required many takes, not because Gibson was struggling with the delivery. He had lived inside this character for months and knew exactly who this man was. The multiple takes were necessary because of the extras. 1,000 people standing in a cold field, waiting for a cue, responding to a speech they had heard dozens of times already. Keeping their reactions genuine and powerful across take after take was incredibly difficult. After the third or fourth full run-through, some extras were visibly flagging. Their cheers were getting quieter. Their raised weapons were drooping slightly. The crew had to find ways to refresh the energy in the crowd between takes, music, breaks, encouragement from assistant directors walking the line. The final take used in the film was assembled partly from different shooting angles, captured at different moments across that long, cold day. The single most iconic speech in the film was built from fragments. One word that shook a generation came from 100 exhausted people doing it again one more time. Number 1. The film that rekindled Scottish identity. This is the fact that matters most. Braveheart is a film full of historical inaccuracies. The bridge was removed. The kilts were wrong by 3 centuries. The love story was largely invented. The timeline was compressed. Academic historians have written articles listing everything the movie gets wrong. And yet, something real happened because of this film. After Braveheart was released in 1995, something shifted inside Scottish culture. Tourism to Scotland increased dramatically. Interest in Scottish history, real Scottish history with all its complexity and nuance, grew in ways that surprised historians and educators alike. In 1997, Scotland voted in a referendum to establish its own parliament for the first time in nearly 300 years. Multiple Scottish politicians and commentators, speaking both at the time and in the years since, have referenced Braveheart as part of the emotional climate that made that vote possible. A film created by an Australian-American director, shot mostly in Ireland, wearing costumes from the wrong century, speaking dialogue written by an American whose surname happened to be Wallace. This film helped a real nation rediscover its sense of self. Randall Wallace has spoken in interviews about the strange, almost circular feeling of that outcome. He wrote a story about a man who inspired a nation. And the story itself inspired a nation. Not the same nation, not in the same way, and not through actual history. Through feeling, through cinema, through the oldest human technology of all, the story told around a fire that makes people remember who they are. Braveheart did not give Scotland its identity. It reminded Scotland that it already had one. The film was imperfect. The feeling was real. Bonus fact. The ending that almost wasn't here is a story that very few people know, even among dedicated fans of the film. The ending of Braveheart, the moment where Robert the Bruce leads the Scottish army at Bannockburn, and the narrator tells us that they won their freedom, was not the original ending planned for the film. The early versions of the script and the early cut of the film ended in a more ambiguous, downbeat place. The execution of Wallace was meant to be nearly the last thing the audience experienced. His sacrifice, his death, and a quiet sense of loss that would carry them out of the cinema. Gibson himself debated this question for months during editing. He understood the argument for the darker ending. It was more honest, more brutal, more in keeping with the historical reality that Wallace died in agony and did not live to see the Scotland he fought for. But he also understood something else. This was not only a story about one man's death, it was a story about what that death made possible. To end on the execution was to make Wallace's sacrifice feel final and purposeless. To end with Bannockburn, with Robert the Bruce leading a charge and whispering Wallace's name, was to suggest that sacrifice has a future, that what one person gives in the darkest moment carries forward into light. Gibson chose the light. The decision was debated until very late in post-production. The final sequence featuring Bannockburn was assembled with care, using narration to bridge the historical gap between Wallace's death and the later Scottish victory. The two events were separated by 9 years in real history. The film compressed them into a feeling. And that feeling, the sense that a life given in love for something bigger than oneself is never truly lost, is what audiences carry home. Old sacrifice, new freedom, one story told right. Braveheart is not a perfect film. It never claimed to be. What it is something rarer, a film that feels true even when it isn't accurate. It is a story about the price of courage, the weight of love, and the strange, stubborn power of a single human being who decides that some things are worth dying for. Every fact we uncovered today, the blue paint, the Irish fields, the wrong kilts, the missing bridge, the real mud, the exhausted extras, the word freedom spoken again and again until it finally sounded like the first time. All of it points to the same truth. Great stories are not built from perfection. They are built from passion, from effort, from people who care so deeply about what they are making that the imperfections become part of the magic. Mel Gibson made a film about a man who was imperfect, fighting for something much larger than himself in conditions that should have defeated him. And in doing so, he made a film that was exactly that. If these stories moved you, or surprised you, or made you want to watch Braveheart again tonight, good. That's exactly what stories are for. Subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.